On today's episode, we will be talking about white-collar crimes, and in the studios right now we have Hadiel Hussien from BSA. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Right, so Hadiel, tell me more about BSA. What is it that you do and what is it that BSA does?
Okay, so BSA is a regional firm. We have presence in 9 different cities, countries in the region and abroad in Europe. We have presence in Paris and in Spain. We specialize in both corporate financing, litigation, onshore and the IFC courts. So having expertise with lawyers coming from different backgrounds, different jurisdictions, we have basically a variety of lawyers from different jurisdictions working all together on different sectors. So I personally work in the litigation department. Okay. I'm a litigator. Part of my job is also white-collar crimes.
All right.
And we do different types of litigations or litigation matters. It involves commercial matters, dispute resolution, alternative dispute resolution, as well as, as I mentioned, employment, commercial, criminal, and many others.
Oh wow, quite a lot. So now getting to the topic in question today. So white-collar crimes. So what exactly in the UAE and in the region are considered as white-collar crimes?
So generally, going back to the definition of white-collar crimes, they're crimes that are driven or that are referred to financial crimes or motivated with basically crimes that are motivated with deceit, concealment in order to illegally obtain funds, services, or properties. Some examples of these crimes are embezzlement, fraud, cyber crimes right now with the new technologies, and many others.
Right.
Many others.
Considering Dubai is a very business-driven market, what would you say is the UAE state when it comes to the financial sector, white-collar crimes, etc.?
In one word, I'd say they're up to date.
Right.
So, basically, we've seen that recently in the past few years, a lot of laws have been enforced, issued with the aim of keeping up with these developments and progresses in the financial sector as well as technology. Mm-hmm. So a few examples of these laws are the anti-money laundering law, anti-bribery laws, cybercrime laws, and as well as the VAT law.
Right.
So the introduction of this new VAT laws has actually encouraged people, or business owners to be more specific, stakeholders, to prepare and maintain their financial records. And I believe this has started a few months in advance before the enforcement of the law or its implementation. It had a very positive impact on business owners as well as internally maintaining their financial records, achieving transparency as well. So to sum up, basically, it is very clear that the UAE has a clear vision that was also announced in its national agenda of 2021, which is basically clearly reflected in its issuance of the new regulations and legislations.
Right. So now that you mentioned a bunch of them already, the anti-money laundering law, anti-bribery law, etc., can you give us more details on it? Because I'm sure a lot of people who are watching us don't know because they are fairly new.
So briefly, this is a very brief, very broad topic, but in a nutshell, I can tell you that the anti-money laundering law and as well as the anti-bribery law, which is anti-money laundering law, was issued recently in 2018, but as we usually say, better late than never.
Yeah.
So it is a pretty recent and fresh law, and where there's always room for improvements. And basically, what I see with regards to the anti-money laundering law, it is essentially addressed, or it essentially addresses or mitigates the risks of financial crimes involving money laundering. And this is also followed or regulated by the DFSA, the Dubai Financial Services Authority, whereby they have their own regulations for companies or establishments located within the free zone, or the zone to be specific,
right.
the IFC. So with regards to other laws such as cyber crimes law, this has also had a very strong impact in terms of the public and how the government reacted to it and how people reacted to it. I could summarize it in a few words to say that sometimes people underestimate their actions while using technologies, and this specific law has been issued to regulate people's usage of artificial intelligence and technologies. It has been significantly important to this industry, and it has been severely implemented. So in practice and in theory, basically, right, they've been achieving what they have had envisioned. So
right, I'm going to get to the role of technology in a bit, because that's again a different topic that we need to talk about. But speaking of the anti-money laundering law, AML, CFT sections, all of these were provisions that came under the law. But right now, when you talk about it, what would you say is the significance of this law, and why was there a need for such a law to be implemented in the country?
Okay, significance. One, for foreign investors, business owners, it creates transparency for investors globally, global investors and local investors. Attracts investors to basically enter into the market. Knowing that everything is regulated and clear, I'd be more keen on investing in the UAE or in the region.
Right.
So definitely a significant impact.
Right. How legally binding would you say this is then?
It's definitely binding since it's implemented and enacted.
Right.
But as using the word binding doesn't necessarily mean that people will comply. All laws are binding, but again, in practice or in reality, you will always find people who are going to subvert from the law, and this is why we have penalties and punishments for that.
Right.
The issue is, or the question that I would raise here is that how severe are these penalties, and whether or not the penalties are basically creating or dissuading and discouraging people from committing crimes such as white-collar crimes.
Right. Now we are talking about anti-money laundering law, corruption cases, etc. And one of the bigger cases that we did see in the past few months was, of course, Abraj case. A lot of updates coming on that. But just to give us an overview of what happened there and what went wrong exactly, can you tell us more?
Briefly, Al-Abraj case has been far-reached. It has hit the media very strongly, created a lot of attention. So what has happened is that the stakeholders, the company basically, commingled investors' funds, misappropriated them, and therefore there were consequences for that. This had entailed an investigation by one of their largest investors, which ultimately rendered them to expose the fact that they were not properly using investors' funds. It's a lesson, basically. I'd say it might have impacted or harmed a lot of investors at that point, or when it occurred in 2018, but it's definitely a good lesson for both the legislators and the public.
Right.
It creates awareness. The fact that it's covered by media, there's full coverage, and as you said, there are updates, which is actually the company is currently under investigation. And how it impacted it financially, I could tell you that the fines were pretty big. Fines were imposed by the DFSA with an amount of, I believe, $315 million, which is a significant amount.
Yeah.
The costs of losses, I believe, was 1.1 billion. Or actually not losses, the scam itself, or the amounts that were misappropriated. So I think the figures are a bit shocking.
So is it the figures that actually made it different from the other white-collar crimes and other cases we've seen in the region?
No, I mean, yeah, I believe it's the concept itself. It's not the figures, because whether it's a small amount or a big amount, as an investor or as a third party, it would definitely affect me. It's not how to say this in simple words. It's not the amount, basically. It's not the amount. It's the impact, and it's how it affected other businesses, basically. Trust. As a foreign investor, would I invest again? So definitely the laws that are now implemented are here to put a buffer, to keep up with such cases, and it's not the only case, basically. It has happened not only regionally, but internationally. It's not something new, but as I mentioned, it's a very good lesson, and we should learn from it.
But do you think the regulations and the measures taken by the authorities have sort of been reactionary and not proactive?
On the contrary, they have been proactive. The fact that the laws that we've mentioned doesn't necessarily mean that an Abraj case was the reason why they were introduced, but it's just a small example of a motivation, or one of the motivations, basically, that makes the public more aware, basically, to such scenarios that could take place. So
yeah, sure. So now there's corruption, there's embezzlement, there's also bad debts, etc., which are sort of the mainstream white-collar crimes. But then in this region, we've seen one word that is being used a lot, which is nepotism. And there are different variations of nepotism that's used. We talk about wasta. I mean, I know you disagree with that being a bad term that's used. But then while talking about nepotism in the region, do you think this one prevalent question is your son the apt successor for your business? Do you agree with that in most cases?
See, I'd put it under the category of both positive and part of the culture. Not only in the UAE, it's a regional adopted, and it's regional, common. Yet again, as you mentioned, I do disagree with the idea of making it a negative mechanism. It's really not. If we use it and implement it in the correct manner, then it should not be negative. I shouldn't be concerned about nepotism when I'm basically following the rules, following the regulations, because the whole purpose of the regulations are to regulate, to mitigate risks, and it's not to basically make it difficult for, and not only not to make it difficult, but there are other ways, such as proper corporate governance, raising awareness, internally implementing processes and procedures. All of this basically mitigates the risks of nepotism. So again, it might be sometimes we sell it as a negative notion, but it's not if it's implemented in the proper way.
Right, and what would you say is the proper way, if you could give us more details on that?
As I was mentioning, basically, the internal processes and procedures, if a big corporation basically has its own internal policies and procedures, and there are many ways to basically make people more aware of what's right and what's wrong, because sometimes corporate governance, for example, it's a compilation of internal procedures and policies that distributes responsibilities responsibilities and rights to different categories or different participants of the corporation. That basically, again, going back to corporate governance, that basically prevents having control from one person, from one person only. Everybody has their own role, and it mitigates the risks of corruption, mitigates the risks of white-collar crimes and nepotism, the idea of, or the negative idea of nepotism.
Right.
So
now, just speaking of the negative idea of nepotism then, again, you don't have to agree with me, but there are a lot of reports that we've read about how unemployment has been caused because of nepotism, and especially youth unemployment has been caused because of nepotism.
it might be a result of it, but again, going back to the internal procedures and processes that I was speaking about, within a establishment, should we have a certain procedure that we will follow, and there are basically internal audits that are conducted and many other ways of raising awareness. If these are followed in the proper manner and the law is implemented, we shouldn't be concerned about these things.
Right.
However, sometimes what's in theory is not what is in reality. So
yeah, fair enough. So now help me understand this Middle Eastern idea of wasta that we have. I know you were explaining it to me a little bit earlier, and I think that was brilliant, like the way you explained it to me. So it doesn't really have to be a negative thing. So
it's really not. When people use the term wasta, it might be always associated with a negative idea, but how I see it is that it's a way of reaching your goals, targets with your connections. It doesn't necessarily mean that it is positive or not necessarily associated to the negative idea of nepotism. But again, it's part of the culture, not only in the region, in the Middle East, I would say. They should create a word in English.
Yeah. Now that could be one of the solutions. But now we've spoken about a lot of laws, a lot of new rules coming in, a lot of amendments, and obviously looks like the regulations are going to be stricter after we've seen such high-profile cases coming out in the light. So would you say all of this would sort of hinder the ease of doing business in the UAE, especially for the new companies that want to come up and set up here?
On the contrary, we believe I don't think it's just a personal opinion. We believe that having these more stringent laws are a way to facilitate business owners, businesses here, and it's meant to prevent, it's not meant to prevent the occurrence of a crime, but it's meant to regulate businesses and to facilitate businesses within the country. So I would disagree with the statement, and I would state the opposite, basically, that these laws might be a reason to improve business owners.
All right, so coming back to cyber and the role of technology that we were just discussing, what do you think would be the role of emerging technologies like AI, VR, XR, etc. in all of this?
It could be advantages and disadvantages. If used in the proper manner, I believe it would be a very good and useful tool to track violators of the law. Back then in the days, for example, when VPN did not exist, it was definitely more difficult and more time consuming and complex to find a violator, while right now with the technology that we have, it's 10 times easier. So it plays a role. But with the developments that we have all the time, there will always be law updates to keep up with the crimes that might come up. Open Google and look for white-collar crimes. You'll find crimes that I've never heard of. So, because of these technologies, there will always be new ways of committing crimes, and this is why the law should be always up to date and regulations should be always up to date. And I genuinely believe that this is achieved here in this part of the region, and not only it is achieved, they're way ahead of many other jurisdictions within the region.
Right, so now speaking of VPN, obviously Skype, WhatsApp calls, all of that has been banned for national security reasons, of course. That's what's out in the open, but VPN sort of facilitates that as well. So are there laws or specific rules and regulations governing the use of VPN now?
Okay, so specific laws and rules, I'd refer to the cybercrime laws and penal code and many others that probably address these issues. And yet again, I would agree with the fact that it is limiting the usage of Skype and many other many other applications. But at the same time, for purposes of communication, sometimes we take it from one perspective, but if you look at it at a larger, from a larger perspective, it sort of mitigates risks. So I would agree with banning them, let's say. So
All right.
on a personal basis.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure a lot of us who are watching us right now will probably not agree. But now we're running short of time. There's just this one other topic that I would like to cover. It affects a lot of people who are watching us right now, which is bounce check, which has sort of been a grey area when it comes to clarity on what the rules and laws are revolving it, and also if it is considered as a white collar crime specifically or not. So we've heard a lot of updates coming on bounce check, and probably not even updates, just clarity on the whole issue. Is that a crime? Is that a civil court case right now?
So it's both. There's always, with regards to bounce checks, there's two aspects of it. You've got the criminal part, which is issuing a check in bad faith, because there's a debt. To cover it, you're issuing a check. And when issuing a check, you're sort of committing to a payment. When I issue the check and I know that there's no money in my bank account, then it is sort of with criminal intent, and therefore qualified as a criminal action. With regards to the civil part of it, that's the value that you're going to claim for him as a plaintiff. So yes, it addresses both sides. In terms of the clarity, I would say that the new updates that have been issued by the legislators, it addresses, they've set a threshold for jail time for issuing a check in bad faith. The threshold is 200,000, I believe, and above, or any checks actually less than 200,000 should not entail jail time.
Right.
Which I believe is a positive move with regards to put this in simple words, it is positive in terms of, if you look at it, but for example, someone being in jail for a check for 1,000, it does not make sense. It is more of leniency and flexibility here, and clarity, as you mentioned.
All right, so now we do have specific figures, but now just on those lines, banks obviously have a huge role to play when it comes to litigation, when it comes to implementation, and when we're talking about checks, we can't talk about checks without talking about banks. So what is the role of banks in all of this?
So roles of banks, obviously as a plaintiff pursuing a complaint in relation to a bounce check, you cannot complete your procedure of a complaint without the prosecution having issuing a letter to, or the police issuing a letter to the bank seeking details of the bank account. So I would definitely agree that they play a very important role in litigation. They're a mode of achieving justice, implementing the laws, and not only in issuing bounce checks, but also in other white collar crimes. In order to achieve justice here, I as a plaintiff wouldn't have all the information that I require to complete the investigation, and therefore they're definitely relied upon, and in other words, they play a big role with the database and information that they have of the account holders.
Thank you so much, Hadiel, for joining us today, and thank you so much for shedding light on white-collar crimes. We've definitely learnt more about it. And thank you for watching AB Live. We will be back again next Tuesday.